The wind off the North Pacific is a feral thing, a shrieking beast made of salt and ice. It tears at the scraggly pines clinging to the cliffside, clawing at the very shingles of her small, lonely house. For 3 nights, Ilara has fought it. For 3 nights, she has stood on the precipice where the land gives way to a churning chaos of black water and white foam, lighting the lanterns. Her fingers are raw, her knuckles split and bleeding from the cold and the stubborn metal latches. Her wedding dress, a simple thing of practical wool, is frayed at the hem and stained with mud and whale oil, but she wears it still. A bride's vigil. One by one, she sets the lanterns along the treacherous path leading from the cliff's edge to her door. Each light is a prayer, a desperate beacon against the throat of the storm. Each flame she coaxes to life is a denial of the cold truth whispering in the gale. The sea serpent is gone. Her husband, Captain Jasper Thorne, is gone. But denial is all she has left. From his lonely perch a mile up the coast, the lighthouse keeper sees her. A tiny, defiant figure haloed by a string of foolish, flickering lights. He sees the storm trying to sweep her from the rock like a gull. He sees a courage so profound it borders on madness. He knows the ship she waits for. He knows its captain. And he knows, with the certainty of a man who has read the sea his entire life, that no ship could survive this. Her vigil is for a ghost. He keeps his own light, a singular, powerful eye that sweeps the horizon in a steady, metronomic rhythm. His duty is to that lamp, and that lamp alone. But as a rogue wave explodes against the cliff, and her small form nearly disappears in the spray, something in him breaks. The keeper's discipline cracks, and the man beneath it stirs. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. He watches her stumble, right herself, and stubbornly relight a lantern that has been extinguished. Her hope is a brighter, more fragile flame than any she could possibly kindle. It is a flame he feels an inexplicable urge to protect. And so, with 3 words muttered to the empty air of the lamp room, the devil take it, his life and hers are irrevocably changed. For the first time in a decade, Silas Blackwood chose to forsake the lamp and descend into the storm, not as a keeper, but as a man. He moved with the grim purpose of someone for whom haste was an unnatural state. The spiral staircase of the lighthouse, 313 iron steps, protested under his heavy boots. For 10 years, his world had been this tower, this island of stone and glass on the edge of the continent. It was a penance and a refuge, a place where the ghosts of his past were kept at bay by the sheer, monotonous weight of duty. He was Silas Blackwood, keeper of the Port Faro Light, a title that felt more like a sentence than a profession. The sea had taken everything from him once, his ship, his crew, his nerve, and in return, he had given it his solitude. The wind hit him like a physical blow as he exited the tower's base, stealing the air from his lungs. He cinched the collar of his oilskin coat, the material stiff and cold, and leaned into the gale. The path to her cabin wasn't long, but it was treacherous, a ribbon of mud and slick rock that snaked along the coastline. He carried a heavy coil of rope over one shoulder and a storm lantern of his own, its flame burning with a steady, protected intensity that mocked the frantic dance of the lights on the cliff. He found her just as he had seen her from his tower, a wraith in a ruined wedding dress, fighting a losing battle against the elements. Her face, pale and streaked with rain, was set in a mask of fierce concentration. Her hair, the color of autumn honey, had come loose from its pins and whipped around her head like a wild banner. She didn't see him approach, her entire being focused on a single, sputtering lantern. He reached the cliff's edge just as another monster wave gathered itself out in the darkness. He saw the swell, felt the shift in pressure, the deep, guttural roar that preceded the impact. He didn't shout a warning. The wind would have eaten the words. He simply closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, his hand clamping around her arm like a vice. She cried out, a sound of shock and fear, twisting to see who had grabbed her. Her eyes were wide, the color of a stormy sea themselves, a deep and turbulent gray. In that instant, the wave hit. A mountain of cold, dark water erupted over the ledge, a force that would have swept her away as easily as a piece of driftwood. But Silas was an anchor. He dug his heels in, his body a bulwark against the torrent, pulling her back from the brink and shielding her with his own larger frame. The water receded with a hungry hiss, leaving them soaked and shivering. For a moment, they stood locked in that tableau, his hand still gripping her arm, her body pressed against his, the roar of the storm filling the space between them. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he finally bellowed, his voice a raw gravel that carried over the wind. She pushed away from him, her defiance flaring even in her shock. "I'm lighting the way. He needs a light to find the channel." The absurdity of it, the sheer, tragic futility, scraped at his composure. He gestured angrily at the raging sea. "There is no channel in this. There is only rock and ruin. You're going to get yourself killed for nothing." "You don't know that," she screamed back, her voice thin but passionate. "You don't know him. He's the best captain on this coast." "I know the sea," Silas retorted, his words sharper than he intended. "And I know a lost cause when I see one. A dead man needs no guide, miss." The words struck her like a slap. The fire in her eyes wavered, replaced by a flicker of raw, bottomless pain. He saw it and immediately regretted his cruelty. This wasn't the time for hard truths. This was a time for shelter. "Come," he said, his tones softening slightly. "You'll catch your death out here. Let me see you home." She resisted for a moment, her gaze still fixed on the churning darkness where a ship ought to be. Then a shudder racked her body, a tremor not just from the cold but from the slow, creeping poison of his words. She gave a small, defeated nod. He didn't release her arm. He kept a firm hold, guiding her away from the cliff's edge, away from her string of dying lights. The path to her cabin was a quagmire. She stumbled, and he held her steady. The house was little more than a shack, built by her husband with more speed than care. It seemed to crouch against the landscape, bracing itself against the storm. The wind moaned through the ill-fitting window frames. He pushed the door open and ushered her inside. The interior was dark, cold, and starkly bare. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner. A stone fireplace, swept clean but empty of wood. A chill emanated from the hearth that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of neglect, of a home without warmth. His eyes swept the room, taking in the details with a practiced, observational efficiency. The pantry shelf held a half-empty sack of beans and a few tins. The wood box beside the fireplace was empty, utterly empty. Captain Thorne had left his bride with nothing to fight the cold but the wool of her wedding dress and a hope that was now guttering like her lanterns in the rain. Alara stood dripping in the center of the small room, looking lost and diminished without the storm to fight against. She hugged herself, her teeth chattering. Silas said nothing. He turned, went back out into the maelstrom, and walked to the woodshed behind the cabin. It too was nearly empty, but there were a few logs, damp and mossy. He grabbed his axe from where he'd leaned it against the outer wall and, in the driving rain, began to split them. The solid, rhythmic thud of the axe was a punctuation mark in the howling chaos of the night. He worked until he had a respectable pile of firewood, then carried it, armload by armload, into the house. He knelt at the hearth, his movements precise and economical. He laid the kindling, arranged the logs, and with a flint and steel from his own pocket, coaxed a small flame to life. It caught, grew, and began to throw a warm, golden light across the room, pushing back the shadows. Alara watched him, silent and still. She had not moved from the spot where he'd left her. She looked like a drowned thing, a mythic creature washed ashore. "Get out of those wet clothes," he said gruffly, his back still to her. "There should be a blanket on the bed." He heard a faint rustle of movement behind him. He kept his eyes on the fire, giving her the privacy of his gaze. He thought of his own world in the lighthouse, orderly, solitary, predictable. every tool in its place, every task performed at its appointed hour. It was a life designed to prevent surprises, to keep the messy, unpredictable nature of human connection at a safe distance. And yet, here he was, in a stranger's cabin, building a fire for a woman who was waiting for a man he knew was never coming home. He had stepped out of his tower and into the very heart of the chaos he had spent a decade avoiding. When the fire was crackling steadily, he rose. She was huddled on the far side of the room, wrapped in a threadbare wool blanket, her wet dress in a heap on the floor. Her face in the firelight was terribly young. He hadn't realized just how young she was. 19, maybe 20. A child playing at being a bride. "I have supplies at the tower," he said, his voice quiet now. "Flour, salt fish, coffee. I'll bring some by in the morning." She looked up, her gray eyes shimmering. "You don't have to do that." Captain Thorne was not known for his foresight in provisioning, he stated flatly. It was the closest he could come to calling the man what he was, a selfish, careless brute. "He'll be back soon," she whispered, the words a reflexive defense. "He'll provide for me." Silas didn't argue. He just nodded. He looked around the small, bare cabin one last time, then at the girl wrapped in a blanket, lit by the fire he had built. He had done what he came to do. He had pulled her from the cliff. He had brought her to shelter. But as he turned to leave, he knew it wasn't enough. The storm outside was a temporary danger. The storm she was truly facing was only just beginning. He left without another word, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't go straight back to his tower. He went to his own small cottage at the base of the lighthouse, a place as Spartan as hers, but filled with the quiet comforts of a man long accustomed to his own company. He packed a canvas sack with flour, a slab of bacon, a bag of coffee beans, and a small tin of tea. He added a jar of his own preserved peaches, a rare luxury. He carried the sack back to her cabin and left it on the porch, a silent offering against the door. Then, and only then, did he return to his light, climbing the 313 steps back to his lonely vigil. The image of her pale, defiant face burned into his mind. The storm broke with the dawn. The wind gentled to a breeze, and the sea, though still swollen and gray, had lost its murderous rage. Port Faro emerged from the tempest like a half-drowned dog, shaking itself off. The small cluster of buildings huddled around the muddy harbor looked sodden and miserable. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, thin and pale against the bruised sky. News in a place like Port Faro traveled not on the wind, but in the silences between words, in the glances exchanged over the rim of a tin cup. By mid-morning, everyone knew that Silas Blackwood, the hermit of the lighthouse, had left his post during the worst storm in years. And they knew why. He had gone to the Thorn Girl. Alara found the sack of provisions when she opened her door to the pale morning light. She stared at it for a long time, her heart a confusing mix of gratitude and fierce, stubborn pride. To accept it felt like an admission of defeat, a concession that her husband was not coming back, that she was truly alone and in need of charity. But the smell of coffee that faintly emanated from the canvas was a powerful argument, and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach was another. She carried the heavy sack inside, her cheeks burning. She had come to Port Faro 2 months prior, a bride-by letter for a man she had never met. Jasper Thorne's letters had been brief but persuasive, painting a picture of a master mariner carving a fortune from the sea, a man who needed a steady hand to keep his home while he was away. He had sent a photograph, a handsome man with bold eyes and a confident smile, standing on the deck of his ship. Alara, an orphan with no prospects and a life spent in the drab servitude of a distant relative's home, had seen a chance for a life of her own. The reality had been a shock. The man who met her at the dock was harder than his photograph, his confident smile more of a smirk. His charm was a thin veneer over a core of cold possessiveness. The house he'd built was not a home, but a cage, isolated from the town, with the sea as its warden. He treated her not as a wife, but as another of his acquisitions, something to be locked away until he had use for it. He was a man of sudden, unpredictable tempers and long, chilling silences. He had stayed for 2 weeks, a tense and miserable honeymoon, before the sea called him again. "Keep the house," he'd ordered. "Don't go into town. I'll be back before winter with a hold full of furs from the north." He had left her with a pittance of money and a pantry that was already half empty. She had obeyed, mostly. Her isolation was profound. The women of the town, the few she saw on a rare trip for essentials, looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They knew Jasper Thorne. They knew his nature. They saw her as a fool who had willingly walked into a trap. Her vigil with the lanterns had not been born of love. She did not love Jasper Thorne. She feared him. The vigil had been born of a desperate, terrified hope. His return, however dreadful, was a known quantity. The alternative, being abandoned, a widow without proof, destitute in this harsh, unforgiving place, was a terrifying unknown. The lanterns were a shield against that terror. Later that day, she saw a figure approaching her cabin. It wasn't the lighthouse keeper. This man was stout, florid-faced, with a proprietary air that set her teeth on edge. It was Mr. Barlow, the owner of the town's only saloon and general store. He was the one who had looked at her with the most undisguised contempt when Thorne had introduced her. He stopped a few feet from her door, his eyes cataloging the damage from the storm. "Quite a blow," he said, his voice oily. "Heard you were out in it. Try to light a ghost ship home." Alara stiffened. "My husband's ship is sturdy." Barlow let out a short, unpleasant laugh. "Sturdy, maybe, but Thorne's luck has been running thin for a long time. He owes a lot of money in this town. To me, especially." He took a step closer, his gaze dropping to the sack of provisions she had left just inside the door. "Looks like you found a new benefactor, though. The lighthouse ghost himself." "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice cold. "Don't you?" Barlow's eyes narrowed. "Blackwood hasn't set foot in town in 5 years. Then you show up, and he's out in a gale, playing the hero. People are talking. A captain's wife shouldn't be entertaining callers, especially when her husband's affairs are so deeply in arrears." The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. He was linking her to Thorne's debts. She was, in his eyes, another of the captain's assets to be claimed. "You should leave," Alara said, her hand tightening on the doorknob. "Oh, I'll leave," Barlow said with a sneer. "For now. But you be wise to remember who you belong to, Mrs. Thorne. A debt is a debt, and sooner or later, it always gets paid." He turned and walked away, his heavy tread leaving deep impressions in the soft mud. Alara watched him go, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. She closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. The fire Silas had built had long since died, and the cabin felt colder than ever. A few days later, Silas came again. He didn't knock. She saw him from the window, walking toward her woodshed with his axe slung over his shoulder. He worked for an hour, the steady, rhythmic chop a comforting sound in the quiet afternoon. He stacked the wood neatly against the cabin wall, a bulwark of warmth against the coming winter. He did it all without a word, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for a lighthouse keeper to become a widow's woodcutter. When he was done, she unlatched her door and stepped out. She held a steaming tin cup in her hands. "I made coffee," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped, turning to face her. He looked tired, his face etched with the deep lines of solitude and a sorrow she couldn't name. But his eyes, a surprisingly clear and steady blue, were kind. He took the cup from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. The brief contact sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low, rusty from disuse. They stood in silence for a moment, the sea whispering on the shore below them. It was an awkward, fragile truce. "Mr. Barlow came to see me," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Silas's expression tightened. The kindness in his eyes was replaced by something harder, something watchful. "What did he want?" He said Captain Thorne owes him money. He said a debt always gets paid. She couldn't bring herself to repeat the rest of his insinuations. Silas took a slow sip of the coffee, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Barlow is a vulture who mistakes a man's misfortune for an invitation to feast." He looked back at her, his eyes meeting hers directly. You are not one of Thorn's debts." The certainty in his voice was a shield. For the first time since arriving in Port Faro, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was a fragile, unfamiliar feeling, but it felt a little like safety. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, the question that had been haunting her. He considered the question for a long time, staring into the dark brew in his cup. "When I was a boy," he said finally, his voice soft, "my father was a fisherman. Sometimes, in a storm, a ship would get turned around, lost in the fog. The whole town would come down to the shore, and everyone would light a lamp or a torch. Not because we thought one little light could pierce the fog, but because we knew the man at the helm was fighting for his life, and we wanted him to know he wasn't fighting alone." He looked up from the cup, his gaze holding hers. No one should have to fight alone. He finished the coffee, handed the empty cup back to her, and gave a stiff, formal nod. Then he turned and walked back toward his tower, a solitary figure against the vast, empty canvas of the sea and sky. Alara watched him go, the warmth of the cup he'd held still lingering in her hands. She finally understood. His acts of kindness weren't charity. They were solidarity. He wasn't just a keeper. He was a watcher, a witness. And in her profound loneliness that felt like everything, the days shortened, bleeding into a gray and unforgiving autumn. The arrangement between the cabin and the lighthouse settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Silas would appear, never announced, to perform some necessary task. He mended the leak in her roof, his hammering a steady heartbeat against the silence. He reinforced the shutters, his movements economical and sure. He shared his catch, leaving a string of fresh fish on her doorstep. He never asked for anything in return. He never stayed long. Alara, in turn, found her own ways to breach the distance. She would leave a loaf of fresh-baked bread on the stump near the path to the lighthouse, bread made from his flour. She mended a tear in his oilskin coat, which she'd found draped over her woodpile, leaving it folded neatly where he'd find it. Once, daringly, she picked a small bouquet of hardy, sea-blown wildflowers and left them in a jar by the path. The next day, the jar was gone. They rarely spoke, but a language was building between them, woven from these small acts of care and provision. In his quiet, consistent presence, she began to see the man behind the myth of the lighthouse hermit. She saw the deep-set sadness in his eyes, a grief he wore like a second skin. But she also saw a profound decency, a steadfastness that was as reliable as the sweeping beam of his lamp. She began to mend not just his coat, but her own tattered spirit. The terror of her situation began to recede, replaced by a tentative, fragile resilience. For Silas, these brief excursions from his tower became the focal point of his days. Alara was a puzzle he couldn't solve. He saw her strength, her stubborn refusal to be broken. He saw her kindness in the small gifts she left for him. He was a man who had intentionally hollowed out his own life, and she was slowly, quietly, filling the empty spaces. He found himself thinking of her at odd hours, his gaze drifting from the horizon to the small, vulnerable cabin on the cliff. He was a keeper of the light, but he was becoming the keeper of a single, fragile flame. One afternoon, as a cold rain misted down, he found her on the beach, gathering driftwood. She was dragging a large, waterlogged piece of timber, her small frame straining with the effort. He came up behind her and took the wood from her hands without a word. He carried it easily back to her cabin and began to saw it into logs. She stood watching him, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "You don't have to do all this," she said, the protest sounding weak even to her own ears. He didn't stop sawing. "Winter is coming. The house is not well built. It will need a lot of firewood." "I'm not helpless," she insisted, a flash of her old pride returning. He finally stopped and looked at her, his blue eyes serious. "I never for a moment thought you were. Mrs. Thorne," he used her formal name, as he always did, but the way he said it felt different. It felt like a recognition of her struggle, not just a label. But even the strongest tree can't stand against the wind without roots. The quiet intimacy of the moment was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They both turned to see two riders coming down the path from the town. One was the port's self-appointed sheriff, a hulking man named Croft whose loyalty belonged to whoever paid him most recently. The other was Barlow. Barlow's face was a mask of smug satisfaction. He reined in his horse and looked from Alara to Silas, then to the pile of wood Silas had just cut. Well, well, he drawled, isn't this a cozy domestic scene? The grieving widow and the lonely light keeper. Silas straightened up, his hand resting on the handle of the saw. He didn't say a word, but his stillness was more menacing than any threat. Just making a friendly inquiry, Croft, Barlow said to the sheriff, though his eyes never left Silas. Making sure Mrs. Thorne is secure. Her husband left considerable debts. It wouldn't do for his property to be misappropriated. The word property hung in the damp air, ugly and obscene. Alara flinched as if struck. She is not his property, Silas said, his voice dangerously low. Oh, isn't she? Barlow retorted. The law might see it differently. A wife is her husband's chattel, and his debts fall upon his estate. This house, its contents, he let his gaze slide over Alara with insulting deliberation. This is my home, Alara said, her voice shaking but clear. You have no right here. You're home for now, Barlow sneered. But with Thorne declared lost at sea, and it's only a matter of time, his creditors will have their day. I'd be careful who you associate with, Mrs. Thorne. A woman's reputation is all she has, especially a woman in your precarious position. Sheriff Croft shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He was a bully, but he was wary of the lighthouse keeper. Blackwood was a federal employee, which put him in a different category from the town's usual rabble. Barlow, maybe this ain't the time. It's exactly the time, Barlow snapped. Just a friendly warning. To both of you. He gave the reins a sharp tug, turning his horse. He cast one last, triumphant look at Alara's pale, stricken face, then rode off, Croft trailing behind him like a chastened dog. The silence they left behind was heavy and cold. The sound of the saw, the steady rhythm of work was gone. All that remained was the ugly truth of Barlow's words. Alara wrapped her arms around herself, a familiar gesture of defense. But this time, it wasn't enough to stop the trembling. All the fear she had been holding at bay came rushing back in a suffocating wave. He's right, she whispered, her gaze on the gray, indifferent sea. I am trapped. When they declare Jasper dead, what will happen to me? I have nothing. I am nothing. Just his widow. His debt. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She didn't bother to wipe it away. It was in that moment that she finally broke. The facade of the stoic bride, the resilient survivor, crumbled. She sank down onto the pile of driftwood Silas had gathered, buried her face in her hands, and began to weep. Not the wild, desperate sobs of the storm, but a quiet, hopeless sound of utter defeat. She confessed everything then, the words pouring out in a torrent of misery. She told him of Thorne's coldness, his cruelty, the chilling way he looked at her, as if she were a piece of furniture. She told him that the vigil with the lanterns hadn't been for love, but for fear. A desperate, foolish prayer to a man she detested, because the thought of him returning was, at the time, less terrifying than the thought of being left to face the world alone. I wasn't lighting a beacon for him, she choked out between sobs. I was just trying to keep the darkness away. I was so scared. Silas stood over her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He felt a helpless, unfamiliar rage. A rage at Jasper Thorne for his cruelty. A rage at Barlow for his greed. A rage at the world that could take a person so full of light and try to extinguish it. He knelt in the damp sand beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just waited, his presence a solid, unwavering thing beside her in her sea of grief. He was a lighthouse, and she was a ship that had finally, utterly, lost its bearings. He would be her anchor until she found them again. When her sobs finally subsided, he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. You are not his debt, Alara. It was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded strange and wonderful on his lips. She looked up at him, her face tear-streaked and vulnerable. What am I, then? He reached out, his calloused thumb brushing away a tear from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, reverent. You are the woman who lit lanterns in a storm, he said softly. You are the bravest person I have ever known. His words, his touch, the simple, profound truth in his eyes. It was a turning point. In that moment of shared vulnerability, the unspoken bond between them was forged into something stronger, something deeper. He was no longer just a neighbor, and she was no longer just a widow in need of help. They were two solitary souls who had found a flicker of warmth in the cold, and the world seemed determined to snuff it out. As the rain began to fall again, a cold, persistent drizzle, Silas knew that chopping wood and mending roofs would no longer be enough. Barlow had drawn a line in the sand, and soon he would have to choose which side he was on. The weeks that followed were charged with a new kind of tension. The quiet companionship of their shared tasks was now overlaid with the constant, unspoken threat of Barlow's words. Winter was closing in, its breath cold on the back of their necks. Silas found himself making excuses to check on the cabin more often, his protective instincts sharpened to a fine point. He taught Alara how to track and trap small game, showing her how to read the forest as he read the sea. She was a quick study, her hands nimble, her gaze focused. He saw in her a deep well of competence that her life had never allowed her to draw from. In return, she brought a measure of grace to his solitary existence. He would return to his cottage at the base of the tower to find a pot of stew simmering on his hearth, or a clean set of clothes, mended with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. His small, Spartan home began to feel less like a monk cell and more like a place someone might actually want to return to. He hadn't realized how starved he was for that feeling. He started to talk more, sharing stories of the sea, not the tragedy that had driven him to the lighthouse, but tales of distant ports, of strange constellations in the southern sky, of the profound and humbling majesty of the ocean. He spoke of it with a reluctant love, like a man talking about a beautiful woman who had betrayed him. Alara listened, her rapt attention drawing the stories from him. She, in turn, spoke of her childhood, a quiet, colorless existence where she had learned to make herself small and unnoticeable. She spoke of her love for books she'd only read once, of a dream of seeing mountains that weren't perpetually shrouded in sea fog. One evening, he brought news. A supply ship, one of the few that braved the coast in the late season, had relayed a message. The sea serpent had been spotted weeks earlier, far south of its intended course. Engaged in what the other captain cryptically termed disreputable trade, it was rumored to have been carrying contraband, not furs. And it had been pursued by men working for a rival shipping magnate, a notoriously ruthless man named Sterling. This is not just about a storm, Alara, Silas said, his face grim in the lamplight of her cabin. Thorn wasn't just a captain. He was a thief, and he made powerful enemies. The news landed with a heavy thud. Her husband wasn't just a cruel man. He was a criminal, and his crimes had followed her here. What does it mean? She asked, her voice small. It means Barlow might be the least of your worries, Silas said. If Sterling's men believe Thorn left anything of value here, they won't be as patient as Barlow. The fear returned, cold and sharp. But this time it was different. She wasn't facing it alone. She looked at Silas, at his strong, worried face, and felt a surge of resolve. We'll face them, she said. He looked at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. You didn't think I'd let you do it alone, did you? She asked, a faint smile touching her lips. No one should have to fight alone. You told me that yourself. The use of his own words against him sent a strange, warm current through him. He saw her then, not as a victim to be protected, but as an ally, a partner. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. For 10 years, he had been a solitary keeper. Now, it seemed, he had a garrison of 2. The ship arrived 2 days later. It wasn't a familiar vessel. It was a sleek, black-hulled schooner that moved with predatory grace. It anchored in the bay, just outside the harbor, a silent, ominous presence against the gray afternoon sky. Silas saw it from the lamp room, a knot tightening in his stomach. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that Sterling's men had come. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his old Spencer rifle from its rack, checked the action, and filled his pockets with cartridges. He descended the stairs not with the grim resignation of his usual duties, but with a cold, focused fury. The lighthouse keeper was gone. The man who emerged from the tower was the man he had been a decade ago, a captain responsible for his vessel and his crew. And right now, his vessel was a small, vulnerable cabin on a cliff, and his crew was one brave woman with stormy gray eyes. He found Ilera outside, staring at the black ship. She had seen it too. Her face was pale, but her chin was high. "They're here," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. "They'll likely talk to Barlow first. He'll tell them what they want to hear. They'll be here by dusk." He looked at her, at the simple, worn dress she wore, at the way the wind caught the loose strands of her hair. He thought of the ruin of her wedding dress, the symbol of the false promise that had brought her here. That promise had been her cage. He was about to offer her another one, but this one, he prayed, would be a fortress. "Ilera," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Listen to me. There is only one thing these men will respect. Not morality, not justice. Only power. They see you as Thorne's property, a thing to be squeezed for information or profit." "I know," she said, her gaze unwavering. "A captain's wife is his property," he continued, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But a federal lighthouse keeper, his post is sacrosanct. The light belongs to the territory. His authority here is absolute. An attack on him is an attack on the government." He took a breath, the cold air burning his lungs. This was it, the precipice. They won't cross a federal man. He looked her directly in the eye, his own heart pounding against his ribs. "Marry me, Ilera. Not for love, not for comfort, for sanctuary. Let the law be your shield, and this lighthouse your fortress. Become my wife, and let them face the consequences of threatening Mrs. Blackwood." She stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. The wind whipped around them, pulling at their clothes, a prelude to the coming storm of a different kind. He had offered her a marriage of convenience, a legal fiction designed for survival. It was a desperate, calculated move from a man who had forgotten how to feel, offered to a woman who had been betrayed by the very same vow. He watched her, holding his breath, waiting for her answer, knowing that everything depended on it. In the silence that stretched between them, the fate of two lonely souls hung in the balance, caught between the unforgiving sea and the approaching threat. Ilera looked from Silas's earnest, desperate face to the black-hulled schooner in the bay. The ship was a vulture, waiting. Barlow's sneering face swam in her memory. "A wife is her husband's chattel." The words had been meant to wound, to remind her of her powerlessness. Now, Silas was offering to turn that cruel logic into a weapon, a shield. Her first marriage had been a transaction for a new life that turned into a prison. This proposal was a transaction for survival. But as she looked into Silas's steady blue eyes, she saw none of Jasper Thorne's cold possessiveness. She saw worry. She saw respect. She saw a man willing to yoke his own solitary peace to her danger, to stand between her and the darkness. She gave a single, decisive nod. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong above the rising wind. "Yes." Relief washed over Silas's face, so profound it was almost painful to watch. "There's no time for a preacher," he said, his mind already racing. "But the keeper's log is an official document. What I write in it is fact. It will be enough to give them pause. It has to be." He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Stay inside, or the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." She squeezed his hand back, a silent promise. "Be careful, Silas." He gave her a curt nod, the closest he could come to expressing the maelstrom of emotion inside him, and turned toward the path leading to town. He moved with a purpose she had never seen before, the Spencer rifle held loosely at his side, his shoulders set like the rocky promontory his lighthouse was built upon. He was no longer just the keeper. He was the captain, and he was sailing into battle. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, they came. For men, their shapes dark against the fading light. Barlow was with them, leading the way, his face alight with a greedy, vicarious power. The man in the lead was tall and thin, dressed in a long coat that did little to hide the pearl-handled revolver holstered at his hip. He moved with a snake-like fluidity, and his eyes, even from a distance, seemed to glitter with cold intelligence. This was Sterling's man. They stopped at the edge of the clearing in front of Alara's cabin. They had expected to find a frightened, isolated woman. They did not expect to find Silas Blackwood sitting on the porch steps, the Spencer rifle resting across his knees, the dying light glinting off its long barrel. "That's far enough, Barlow," Silas said, his voice calm and carrying easily in the still air. Barlow faltered, his bravado shrinking under Silas's gaze. "Now see here, Blackwood, this is none of your affair. These gentlemen have business with Mrs. Thorne." "There is no Mrs. Thorne here," Silas stated, his voice flat and cold as a stone. The tall man stepped forward, waving a dismissive hand at Barlow. "My name is Fletcher," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, which somehow made it more menacing. "We have reason to believe Captain Thorne, before his untimely demise, left certain assets in the care of his wife. We are merely here to discuss the recovery of our property." "You're mistaken," Silas said, not moving a muscle. "There is no property of Thorne's here." Fletcher smiled, a thin, predatory curving of the lips. "The woman. We wish to speak with the woman." Just then, the cabin door opened. Alara stepped out onto the porch to stand beside Silas's chair. She was afraid. He could feel the fine tremor in the air around her. But she stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze meeting Fletcher's without flinching. Her presence was a silent declaration. "We, not I." Silas rose to his feet, a slow, deliberate movement. He stood beside her, a solid wall of resolve. "You seem to be under a misapprehension, Mr. Fletcher," he said, his voice taking on a formal, official tone. "The woman you are looking for no longer exists. Allow me to introduce you to Mrs. Blackwood." He paused, letting the words sink in. "My wife." A stunned silence fell over the clearing. Barlow's jaw dropped, his face a comical mask of disbelief. Fletcher's smile vanished, his eyes narrowing into suspicious slits. "Your wife," Fletcher repeated, skepticism dripping from the word. "How very convenient. When did this fortunate event take place?" "This afternoon," Silas replied smoothly. "Recorded in the federal log of the Port Faro Lighthouse, as is my right and duty. Which means this cabin, and everything in it, is now the property of a federal employee. And you, gentlemen, are trespassing." He let his gaze drift pointedly toward the lighthouse, whose powerful beam had just begun its majestic, sweeping journey across the darkening coast. The beam sliced through the twilight, washing over them all for a second, a stark white light of authority. Fletcher was no fool. He understood the implications perfectly. Harassing the indebted widow of a deadbeat captain was one thing. Threatening the wife of a federal lighthouse keeper on land protected by that status was another thing entirely. It was a line that, if crossed, could bring a world of trouble down on him and his employer, trouble far greater than the value of whatever Thorne had stolen. "A clever little story, Keeper," Fletcher said, though the confidence had gone out of his voice. "It's the truth," Alara said, finding her voice. It was strong and clear, ringing with a conviction that startled even Silas. "I am Mrs. Blackwood, and this is my husband. He has asked you to leave his land." She stood her ground, her small form radiating a strength that belied her size. In that moment, she was no longer the girl who lit lanterns for a ghost. She was the keeper of a new flame, a fierce and protective fire, and she would not let them quench it. Fletcher stared at them for a long, tense moment, weighing his options. He looked at Silas's unyielding stance, the rifle held at the ready. He looked at Alara's defiant face. He looked at the implacable, sweeping beam of the lighthouse. He had come for an easy prize, a scared woman he could bully and intimidate. He had found a fortress, guarded by two determined people who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. He gave a short, sharp sigh of irritation. The prize was not worth the cost of the battle. It seems we were misinformed, he said curtly. He turned to his men. Let's go. He shot a last, venomous look at Barlow. You've wasted our time. Without another word, they turned and melted back into the shadows, their footsteps receding down the path. Barlow was left standing alone, his face a mess of confusion and thwarted greed. He looked at Silas and Alara, at the two of them standing together as a single, unbreakable unit. He opened his mouth to say something, then seemed to think better of it. He turned and scurried away like the rat he was, disappearing into the night. They were gone. The threat had passed. The immense tension that had held them rigid for what felt like an eternity finally broke. Silas lowered the rifle, the weight of it suddenly immense. Alara let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, her shoulders slumping in relief. They were alone on the porch, bathed in the cool, rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse beam. The marriage of convenience, the lie they had told for survival, hung in the air between them. But as they looked at each other, it no longer felt like a lie. In the crucible of the confrontation, standing together against the world, it had been forged into something real, something true. Alara was the one who moved first. She closed the small distance between them and reached out, her hand tentatively covering his on the stock of the rifle. Her touch was warm, grounding. Silas, she said softly, her voice thick with a universe of unspoken emotion, gratitude, relief, and something else, something deeper and more profound that was just beginning to take root. He looked down at her hand, then up into her face. The solitary keeper, the man who had walled himself off from the world, saw his own reflection in her stormy gray eyes. He saw a man who was no longer alone. He had stepped out of his tower to save her from the storm, and in doing so, had inadvertently saved himself. The words of his proposal echoed in his mind. Not for love, not for comfort, for sanctuary. He had been wrong. In her quiet strength, in her unyielding courage, he had found all three. He covered her hand with his other, sandwiching it between his own calloused palms. The sweeping light of the tower passed over them again, illuminating the truth that needed no words. He had not just become her captain in a moment of crisis. He had become her harbor. And for Silas Blackwood, the lonely keeper of the light, Alara had become his shore. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them?